Welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast. On this episode, we're going to be talking about immigration in France.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists, dynamists, entrepreneurs, the cultural form the national.
You Americans have given us nothing. The sense grows very easy.
Our planet great again.
All right, so immigration obviously is a topic that has been going around in the media, whether you're in France or in the United States. It's always a contentious topic. So Liam, how should we look at immigration kind of in a comparative perspective, like between the US and France and compared to the overall situation in Europe?
Yeah, I think the first thing we should do is just, talk about it in context. I think a lot of people in France, especially, and probably in other parts of Europe too, have a perception that France has a really high percentage of immigrants. But it doesn't so much if you compare it to surrounding countries and to the US. So according to the way France calculates immigrants, which is people who were born abroad without French nationality, about 10% of the population of France are immigrants. But the international data usually uses just all people that were born abroad, which in France's case, there's quite a significant number of immigrants who, or people who were born abroad in a country that's not France, but with French nationality at birth and then moved to France. According to the international data, 13.8% of the French population were born abroad. That's less than the US. In the US, 15.2% of the population was born abroad. That's also less than a lot of France's neighbors. So the UK, 17.1%, Germany, 19.8%, Belgium, 20%, Netherlands, 16.2%, Spain, 18.5%, other Western countries like Canada's 22.2%, Australia, 30.4%. So in context, actually, in a European context and compared to other Western countries, France doesn't have a particularly high percentage of foreign-born population. It's still higher than Italy, and of course it's higher than, unsurprisingly, than most or all of the Eastern European and Central European members of the EU, like Poland, which is very low at 4.5%. But it's not actually, like, percentage-wise, one of the European countries that has the highest portion of immigrants.
I think, intuitively, I know you have the numbers in front of you, but intuitively, I would say that like most of the immigrant population in the United States is probably, at least, in our present decade, from Latin America. Where are the immigrants to France coming from generally?
Yeah, you're right that the US, Mexico dominates, also Central America, of course. Although the US does get a lot of immigration from Asia as well. The US probably has one of the most global, like, absorbers of immigrants, that people sort of come to the US from all over. But in France, that's not the case. In France, it is overwhelmingly migrants are coming from Africa and from Europe. So 47.7% of immigrants in France are from Africa, and 32.3% are from Europe, other European countries besides France. And there are a couple countries that really dominate, and those are Algeria, Morocco, and Portugal. Those are the top three. So Algeria is like over 12% of immigrants are from Algeria, and over 11.7% are from Morocco.
Yeah, and it's probably important to mention here that Algeria used to be a French department up until the mid-20th century. And so, while they're obviously immigrants, there's a certain aspect of it actually being, people who had a strong connection with France and who used to actually live in France.
Yeah, that's right. Also, their countries, and Morocco also was a French colony. Tunisia, also a French colony. And those countries, all three of them still have a strong use of the French language. A very high percent amount of people there speak French already. So they have strong connections to France.
Yeah, and especially in the Algerian case, unfortunately, relations between Paris and Algiers has been getting worse, as I understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, for those of you who don't know, Algeria has a particular, like a special visa/residency regime that initially was somewhat of a concession, right? Like as a way of being like, oh, we're going to allow you to come easier to France than other immigrant populations because we colonized you. But it has almost turned into actually a more restrictive regime in some cases, owing to the tensions between these two countries.
Yeah, Algeria and France, of course, have a long and complicated history. Morocco, it's a bit different, but I think Morocco has always kind of been closer to France. But then you also have a number of people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, although for each individual country, it's less than I would have expected. The top ones are Comoros, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, Cameroon, and Mali. All, again, were French colonies, but their shares are way below what it is for Algeria or Morocco, which is kind of interesting. That wouldn't have been my impression, but I think it might also just be that like those people are concentrated in big cities like Paris. You know what I mean? I feel like there's in Paris you meet a lot of people who have sub-Saharan African descent, but I think that people who are of North African descent or North African immigrants are spread all over France. But then you also have a lot of people coming from mostly other EU countries. That in 2022, 40% of immigrants arriving in France were from other European countries. 34% were from Africa. A lot of those were just Ukrainian. So that was the number one country the past couple of years is people arriving from Ukraine. That's not necessarily lasting immigration. But then you also have a very high number of people from Portugal, especially. Portugal has an incredibly high amount of immigration to France, or at least did. I'm not sure how many people are arriving now from Portugal, but in the past decades, a lot of people came from Portugal to France, also to Switzerland, to Luxembourg, to Belgium. And then you also have Italy up there.
Do you have any understanding as to how the statistics work for Ukrainians? Because as I recall, they actually have kind of this weird system because the EU gave them a special temporary protection that kind of implies they're not expected to stay, but they can eventually have access to an asylum procedure.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they should be showing up in these statistics whether or not they actually applied for asylum, as long as they registered their presence there, which maybe a lot of people didn't.
No, they probably did because there was money associated with getting the temporary protection. Like you got, I don't remember how much it was, but at least a couple €100 a month.
And another thing to say about the number of immigrants residing in France is that quite a large percentage of them have French nationality, have attained French nationality. I think we'll talk about that, but it's relatively easy to get French nationality after living for a number of years, a relatively small number of years, compared to what it's like in the US, for example, legally in France. So there are 2.5 million naturalized French immigrants compared to 4.8 million immigrants of foreign nationality. And I tried to find some statistics on legal immigrants, what they call sans-papiers. Of course, it's hard to have exact data on this because by definition they're illegally. But a lot of the estimates I was seeing were around 500,000 people out of a total immigrant population of about 7 million people. That's about 6.5% of the total immigrant population in France are there illegally, or rather are there in a unregistered way. Let's call them undocumented, right? That's the word that's used in the US. Now, if you compare that to the US, that's a huge difference. So in the US, 23% of the total immigrant population is undocumented. And many of those people, something like 2/3 of those people, have been in the US for more than 10 years. So in the US, you have an endemic problem, as I think everyone knows, of undocumented immigration. Of course, a lot of people would say the endemic problem there is all these people coming in illegally. I would say the endemic problem is that there are so many people who have been in the US for a very long time, have families in the US, who have no path to becoming legal residents.
Or at least no practical one. I mean, the thing about the United States, and we're going to talk about the problems here in France as well and elsewhere, but the thing about the United States is that a lot of these procedures can be pretty onerous, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of time. For example, if you want to, say, bring your wife to the United States, you generally have to wait 2 years in order to just essentially get the visa that allows them to go with you to the United States as your wife, right? And like 2 years is a lot of time to have your life kind of suspended, right? Suspended in midair. And I think that's a huge problem in the U.S. that no one wants to confront. And I also think it's one of those things where it's like, you know, everyone has this assumption that like, immigration only affects, or the problems with the American immigration system only affects the poorest and most vulnerable people, and that is obviously true. But we shouldn't discount, or we still need to account for the fact that the system can be pretty brutal to everybody, and that's one of the reasons why it shouldn't be the way it is.
Yeah, for example, for you, if you don't mind me saying so on the pod, who have a wife who is not an American citizen and has never lived in the US, if you wanted to move to the US right now, you would have a huge headache.
Yeah, exactly. And there's there's different ways of doing it. There is a way where you can kind of just go to the United States and apply once you're there, but that can actually be more complicated than doing it from abroad.
The other thing about the US is when you look at the numbers in the US, what's crazy is that relatively speaking, almost no one in the US is on a work visa or something like that. You know what I mean? The equivalent of a titre de séjour in France. When we look at the numbers, like only 4% of all immigrants to the US are temporary lawful residents, aka people who are students, people who have work visas, people who have any sort of visa that isn't a green card. So that's an almost insignificant part of the immigrant population in the US. Like breaking down the immigrant population in the US, you basically have that half of the immigrant population are naturalized American citizens. A quarter of them are green card holders. We would have to assume mostly through marriage. And another quarter of them are undocumented immigrants. Like the passage there that's supposed to be like the legal way that you move to a country if you're not marrying someone from that country, which is a work visa or something like that, is a rounding error in terms of total immigration to the US.
Since you brought up visas and permits and green cards, it's probably about time we kind of try to give definitions to these things, because honestly, this is one of the most frustrating things about immigration, in my opinion. It's that a lot of people don't understand what these different things are. They use all these words interchangeably. And the reason that's a problem is because if the people who talk about it with some degree of authority don't understand it, how are the immigrants who, are often quite vulnerable, may not be as well educated as the people who are trying to explain this stuff, how are they supposed to understand it? And, you can just find examples online of people, giving bad advice, or, maybe even people who give the appearance of being legal professionals give incorrect information about how this stuff works. So I just want to make some things clear. So there's different ways to be an immigrant in most countries, right? There is normal procedures, right? You want to come on a work permit, you want to go studying, you have some sort of reason that is like why you want to go to a country, right? And that goes through its own process. But then international law has this notion of refugees, right? Refugees are people who are fleeing something and who intend to seek either asylum or subsidiary protection on the basis of the Geneva Convention of 1951. Now, most countries are party to the 1951 Convention, all of Europe, certainly. Some of the quote unquote evil countries like Russia and China. And the United States? Nope, not at all.
Okay. What a shock.
Right. Exactly. So the United States only is party to the 1967 protocol, but not the convention itself. What this means in practice is the rights of refugees in the United States are, at least in law, not as well protected as in most of the world. One aspect, for example, of the notion of a refugee is that since they're fleeing something, they are supposed to be allowed to enter the country and not turned around. So this is called the principle of non-refoulement, or in French, non-refoulement. Basically, you cannot return refugees to dangerous countries. That applies basically everywhere in the world. And, you're not supposed to make them, say, wait in a third country, waiting for you to decide whether or not they are deserving of asylum. So for that reason, if someone makes it to France and asks for asylum, they're supposed to, unless there's a real danger that they supposedly pose, they're supposed to be able to get basically a temporary authorization to be in France, do their normal life stuff until the government or the French administration decides whether or not they are in fact under the law entitled to asylum. Now, that's asylum on one side. There's a lot more complexity there that we could get into maybe in another moment. But then on the other side, as I said, you have the normal sort of residence procedures, right? Now, those start in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases with something called a visa. Now, what is a visa, Liam?
A visa is something that you get to enter a country. People often say that wrong, right? They often say, when I'm speaking, talk about that I'm on a Spanish visa or whatever. It's not the same thing. I'm on a Spanish residency permit. And the visa was what I got initially to enter Spain, right?
So yeah, a lot of people will say that they're on a visa as if that gives them some sort of right to stay. Usually that is not the case. Instead, a visa is just the right to go somewhere. And in order to go somewhere, say you get a visa for France, it's usually on the basis of something. So if you get a visa to come to France in order to work, then that allows you to legitimately enter France on that basis. You might have entered on a work visa. That doesn't mean once you actually get to France, you ask for asylum, for example. Of course, I know especially in the US, this can be problematic because the US kind of has, at least to my understanding, a very kind of strict interpretation here where they're like, whoa, if you change the reason why you're coming here after entering, you committed fraud or whatever by lying to us.
Really?
That's I don't have enough experience to give concrete examples of that, but that's my understanding. They they don't look kindly upon trying to change your reason, the moment you arrive in the country. Because in most countries, once you enter with a visa, you have to establish or get a residence permit in some way. So in France, a lot of students are entitled to something called VLSTS, and it's basically a visa that is valid for 1 year. That means you can enter France. You can come and go from France during that year for the purpose of, say, studies, for example, but it can also be for professional purposes. But once you get to France, you have 3 months to convert that visa through an online procedure or whatever into a residence permit. So that's where the line can get blurred. And in France, they literally call that visa that has the value of a residence permit. So that's where you can, in fact, blur the lines. And then, from there, you can ask for what's called a residence permit. And this is where things also get complicated because, a residence permit in most countries is a bit different than say a green card. So in France, the sort of equivalent of a green card would be called a permanent residency card. And of course, all of that is further compounded by the confusion of the fact that a residence permit usually takes the form of a card, except in the visa example I just gave. And so that just leads to so many imprecisions and people talking across each other because they say, hey, I have a visa for this. And it's and it makes it difficult for kind of everyone on the chain, including, people who are trying to help other people with, their residency problems.
This is the kind of thing that gets Patrick going. Don't care so much about terminological inaccuracies. In fact, I said work visa several times when I was talking before.
Right, but I can give you a concrete example, right? Like if you came to if you went to, like an association or just someone trying to like give you a hand with your procedure and I just accept you saying like, oh, I'm here on a work visa, like everything will be wrong.
If you are talking to about your immigration status to a lawyer or to an immigration authority, I think it is important to understand the difference. Yeah, but in common parlance, it is true that everyone says in English the work visa or visa to mean a residency permit.
Okay, Liam, so how about we talk about how residency concretely works in France? Perhaps our listeners are interested in visiting us. Perhaps they want to follow in our footsteps and study here and eventually find your Bulgarian wife, or in your case, decide to leave France for Spain. What are the different types of residency that's common?
Well, let's start with what you said about visiting. So I think most people in the US know this, is that the US is one of the countries that has visa-free access for visits to the Schengen area. The Schengen area is the customs and visa union of most EU countries, all except for Ireland and Cyprus, I believe, and also includes Norway and Switzerland and Liechtenstein, non-EU members. And if you're an American citizen or the citizen of a number of other countries, including most of Latin America, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, etc., you can visit Europe as a tourist, or I believe also for business reasons, without needing any sort of visa. I think most people are aware of this, and I think actually Americans get more surprised that there are many countries that they do need a tourist visa to enter, including Britain starting this year. Did you hear that?
Oh, I didn't know.
Well, you need a waiver.
Right, yeah.
Like what the US asked for from Europeans. And the EU has kept threatening they're going to do something like that to the US, largely because the US doesn't provide visa-free access to, I think, anyone except for Canadians.
Yeah, we're pretty strict about it.
We're extremely strict about it. But anyway, so if you want to come visit us, there should be no problem if you're an American or a Brit or something like that. Come through. If we can get a big enough concentration of you in Paris, we'll do a live show.
That's right.
Then let's talk about other reasons you could be living in France. So one that, again, people know about, but bears repeating, is if you are a citizen of any EU country, you can come and live in France with, in theory, zero hassle and have almost identical rights as a French citizen. Right?
So yes and no. There are some things where EU citizens actually have more rights than French citizens. But there's also cases, of course, where they have less. For example, you can't vote in a presidential election if you are from a member state of the EU living in France.
Or a parliamentary election. You can't vote in most elections. You can vote in local elections. That's the biggest. I mean, there's several exceptions. We'll have to do an episode about the Schengen zone at some point. But there's several, and just the EU immigration stuff like this in general. But there's several places where member states are allowed to make exceptions, right? And one of them is voting. They don't have to give the right to vote in national elections to other EU members. But in theory, this sort of is one of the founding principles of the EU, that if you're a citizen of Spain, you can just go live in France and vice versa. You might have to register when you're there and so on. And obviously you have to deal with some tax stuff. But from an immigration perspective, there's no problem. The thing about having more rights is kind of a funny thing that does apply sometimes. Can you explain briefly exactly why that is? Because it's kind of leads to some funny things. Kind of an aside, but
yeah, no, but it's kind of fun because so there's the EU Charter. There's this whole legal regime built around the EU, and honestly, it kind of operates in this very narrow way. similar to the federal government, which is that like the federal government can't kind of intervene on matters that are purely internal to the state, right? You know, that's where people always talk about like interstate commerce, right? Like that's how the federal government justifies its like regulation of drugs, for example, because it's like, well, if you allow heroin to be legal in a blue state like Massachusetts, then, you know, it could just go to New York or go anywhere from there. You know, it could go through the mail without restriction, even, you know, so the federal government says, no, this is like a federal prerogative because it affects interstate commerce, and therefore we have a right to regulate it. So that kind of works a little bit the same in the EU, which is that like if we're talking about the rights of French citizens vis-a-vis France, you know, there's a lot of exception there, but generally the EU doesn't really have a reason to be concerned. So I can give an example of this. My wife is from an EU member state and resides in France. Because she has the freedom of circulate or freedom of movement that is guaranteed under EU law, she also has the right to be accompanied by a family member. And because her and I are married, I can apply for a residence permit on the basis of her right to be accompanied by a family member. And this means two things for me. One, my residence permit is free, which wouldn't be the case if my wife was French. And the other thing is that if we were in a relationship that isn't recognized in France, I mean, we are, but say in a country in which gay marriage is illegal and you were married to someone of the same sex, they would have to recognize that for residency purposes if both persons are not, or rather, if one of the persons is an EU citizen not from the specific country, and the other person was from a third country. Whereas if you were, God, that was a convoluted example.
Yeah, but I get the idea. But like in Poland, for example, where gay marriage isn't legal, if you were in a same-sex marriage in another EU country and moved there, they'd have to recognize it, right?
Well, they would at least for the purpose, at least within the framework of the residency stuff, yeah. Which they wouldn't have to recognize if one of you was Polish.
Right. Bizarre. My favorite example of how absurd that can get is what happened with Scottish tuition fees pre-Brexit. You know, the UK has tuition fees, meaning like you have to pay to go to university, unlike in many European countries. And Scotland has a policy of not doing that, but they do it in a sort of like Scotland's a policy of free education, but they do it in a sort of weird way, which is that by Scottish law, there's a limited number of places available in each Scottish university for Scottish students. And those places are free, but the way that them being free works is that the Scottish government pays the Scottish universities for each of those places. And that's only for Scottish residents. And then if you're English or Northern Irish or Welsh, you have to pay tuition fees. However, before Brexit, the courts ruled that the way the Scottish government was doing that would be discrimination if they didn't also open those places up to EU students. So before Brexit, EU students and Scottish students could both go free to Scottish universities, whereas English students, who have the exact same citizenship as Scottish students and are from the same country, had to pay. Kind of bizarre. Because, yeah, they were allowed to discriminate, quote unquote, against English students, but not against French students, for example. Right. So that's all these Portuguese immigrants and these Italian immigrants. They're not on residency cards because they don't need them because they're EU citizens. But then in 2023, the number one category of residency permit that was issued in France was for students. There were 108,000 residency permits issued for students. So how's that work, Patrick?
Okay, so as we've already established, this journey, if you will, begins by applying for a visa in your country of residence at the time you apply. So for Liam and I's case, this was, of course, the United States. There are different procedures for doing this, depending on whether or not you are in a country covered by the, what do they call it? The Campus France regime. Which basically means you apply for university using this special website. Anyway, the details don't matter, but what does matter is that in most cases you will be issued either a VLSTS visa, as I said, or a more standard visa. which will require you applying for a residency permit within the first 3 months of entering France, I believe. And then once you have the status of student, which means that you have successfully applied for your student residency permit, or your visa VLSTS has become a residency permit or a residence permit, you are then allowed to remain in France for the purposes of studying. Now, why are there so many people doing this? Well, for one, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of countries, notably in Africa, that still have a strong attachment to French, often learned French in school, and may have even done already like a bachelor's degree in French in their home country, and then find themselves moving to France. But another reason is because this is a good way to establish an eventual regular residency in France, because the conditions for becoming a student in France are, of course, lower than trying to get a residence, well, first a visa and then an eventual residence permit for the purposes of work.
Yes. And it's almost free. At a French public university, tuition fees are $175 per year at bachelor level and $250 at the master's level. That's not thousands for Americans. That's singular euros. And that's also true for international students.
Yeah, I would add exactly. France tried to begin applying tuition fees, and not ridiculously high ones, but still different tuition fees to foreigners, which, by the way, under EU law is perfectly acceptable as long as it's foreigners.
Yeah, and it's what most EU countries do. And in many EU countries, the difference is huge. Like the Netherlands, university is free if you're European, and then it gets up to 10, 15,000 if you're international, non-EU international. Sweden, it's Sweden, I got into a master's there that would have been free for Europeans, and I think 24,000 euros for me. I didn't do it.
That's absurd.
But
that's absurd. Yeah. And fortunately, and I do say fortunately because this was not a given, right? Fortunately, France's courts said no. They said you can't do this. This is discrimination. Why? Because universities are a public service, and it is illegal to discriminate the nationality of users of a public service. Yeah.
Now, those tuition fees are not, those are only for French public universities. For example, Patrick and I went to a university, institution that, while public, is not technically a university. So it was quite a bit different, and they were able to charge different fees for international students. But that's a whole other topic.
Yes. Another aspect of the student residency permit is that, and this is a huge difference compared to the United States, you have the right to work a part-time job. Now, a part-time job doesn't necessarily mean that you need to work, like you can only work a few hours a week. You can work a full-time week. It's just within the period of 1 year, you can only work 60% of what would be a full year's worth of work. So it's perfectly possible to work a 35-hour a week job during the summer or during vacations, but you couldn't work a full-time job all year round is essentially the idea there.
Yeah. Whereas in the US, this was something I only learned relatively recently, and I was shocked to learn, is that in general, people on student visas are prohibited from working, with some exceptions like working on-campus jobs.
Which, is, it's pretty bad because it means that, first of all, you need to be a certain type of person to go to the US anyway, because you need to be able to afford the insane tuition fees that American universities impose, and for some reason make even more absurd for foreigners in many cases.
Yes.
And then you can't even work. You can't even work at a pizza joint.
And also, a student visa in France is as far as I understand, a pretty trivial thing to get if you get into a French university, which is also pretty trivial in most cases if you have, a high school degree.
We will get into how education works in France on another episode, but something to know is that the idea is that everyone has a right to go to university if that's what they want to do and have the qualifications to do so, as opposed to did you do sports in high school? So that'll be a very interesting episode to do in the future.
Oh yeah, definitely. But my point is that, with the student visas, I'm sure there are some student visas that are rejected, but I think it's only in exceptional cases, right? In general, there's some administrative hassle. It's never fun applying for a visa or residency card. I think, as we'll talk about a bit later. But it's still, if you've gotten an offer from a French university, they're going to give you the visa.
So usually when you get your residency permit, if you are, say, doing a bachelor's degree, which in France is 3 years instead of the US is 4 years, usually you are going to get a card or a permit that reflects that. So you will usually get 2 or 3, I believe it can be 3 years. In any case, it won't be like every single year, you know, right at the end of the year, you have to like get a bunch of signatures and stuff like that. Like you just need to show your transcripts. And you don't necessarily even need to pass your year. Although they do say successful completion of studies is required to like be demonstrated, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to pass. It just means like if you like didn't show up to any of the classes and your transcript reflects that, that's where you might have a problem because they'll be like, okay, well, clearly you're not actually a student.
Right. That's the main thing that they're worried about, and where you'd get in trouble is if they're on a student visa and then just, you know, don't attend at all. Like how Elon Musk moved to the US, right? I believe so.
So another aspect, and again, a big important difference between a residency permit for being a student in France and in the United States is that switching after you have completed your studies, assuming you manage to find a job, to a residency permit which allows working is rather trivial. Now, before people who have gone through this process scream at me and say that that's, you know, that I'm being, you know, it's too blanket of a statement. I mean this relatively compared to the United States, because the policy in the United States is you're supposed to go home. Like the American model of how we do education is like you're supposed to send your best and wellest off students to our universities. They get to make some money off that. They get to be trained in American democracy, our way of thinking, et cetera, and then you're supposed to rise the ranks of your country. Right? I mean, look at like Latin American leaders, you know, any Latin American president, and there's a good chance that you'll see in their background they studied at some Ivy League school and then went home and are now, you know, the heads of their countries, right? Whereas France, that's at least up until now not been the policy. It's been understood that you can do your studies and then get a job because the government just spent all this money training you, right, giving you the best education. So you're supposed to at least stay in France, you know, and even in a more like I guess cynical colonial context, right? They at least want you to like feel and be French before they send you home, not just like wowed by you know, America, right? They want you to, and you know, this happened, right? Like I'm thinking specifically, you know, if you think about like kind of what would happen with you know, places like Vietnam and stuff, you would have these people who would come to Paris and then eventually, you know, go back to their own countries eventually and bring all the French ideology back.
As you said, one of the thought of this is the government made a loss on your education. You know, I saw an estimate from the French government. I don't know if it's true, but they claim it costs like 10,000 euros a year per student to the government, and you're paying 175 euros. So part of the idea there, and of course, immigration policy can be contradictory, but one of the reasonings is, bring well-educated, smart people to France, train them, and then, of course, we want them to stay here. We don't want them to leave with all that education and go help their home country. So part of that is like there's what's that visa you can that residency you can get after you've completed studies in France? Is that just for the masters that then allows you to stay as a job seeker?
So once you have completed your studies, if you have obtained what they call in France a licence professionnelle, which basically translates to like a professional bachelor's, which is basically like a practical bachelor's program. Like basically you do it as an apprenticeship, or if you have a master's, there's other kind of edge cases, but essentially either you have a master's or a professional bachelor's, you can get, after your student visa, you can apply for what is called a residency permit for looking for work or creating a company. And that's really great because it allows you to, you know, actually have the time to find a job in France, figure out how you're going to stay in France. And it allows you to work in the meantime. So for example, like, you know, you just finished your master's in political science, you've realized no one wants to hire you, and you know, you go work at your local brasserie during that year while you try and find, say, work in the OECD, which will pay you less maybe than working at your local BLASK.
The US, to be clear, does have something like this. It's called Optional Practical Training, or OPT. And you can get like a 1-year extension of your student visa to work. I believe you can get an extension on that for another year or two, but it's only for STEM fields, which is kind of funny.
That's great.
Tech. They want tech workers.
And now, just some practical information for people listening. It is often, though, around this point that people actually have a lot of confusion, because in France, there's also something called Passeport Talent, which literally means talent passport, which is, in my opinion, an unfortunate name because, again, one of my issues is that we keep using words that don't mean what they are supposed to mean to describe things, and it just makes everything confusing. No, you are not given a passport in this scenario. Instead, you basically have a fast track to getting a residency permit. If you are a qualified salaried employee, you are being recruited in a innovative enterprise. You are doing a job which is highly qualified. You are on a mission. You are a researcher. You want to create your own company, an innovative project that you want to do that is recognized by the government. You're an investor. You represent a foreign company. You are in an artistic or cultural profession. And finally, you are a world, like an internationally renowned person. Look, all of this is to say this is a fast track for people who are well-to-do or are well set up. Now, and the reason I bring this up is because this is nice if you are one of those people, but it also shouldn't discourage you because there's a lot of people who think that this is the only way to stay in France after they complete their studies. And this is an understandable confusion because, especially with a lot of Americans, because they assume that the French immigration system is just as cruel as the US. But it's in fact not the case. And in fact, most students who do stay in France after will never have this special fast track procedure.
They'll get a work permit, which we'll get to in a minute. But I wanted to say that the Passeport Talent is part of the EU Blue Card program.
Exactly.
Are you familiar with this? It's
yes.
It's adopted since 2009. A program by the EU to do what they call, quote, an answer to the US's green card, which what on earth does that mean? The answer to the US green card is citizenship.
Well, no, it's a permanent residency.
Yeah,
which this is not.
The green card is just permanent residency, but the thing is, people are on permanent residency green cards for long periods of time in the US, which isn't the case in France usually, because in France there's a much quicker path to nationalization.
I'm actually going to push back on that a little bit. You are not entirely wrong, but you're mostly wrong because a lot of people will find themselves on residency cards in France because they will never be eligible or can never be eligible for applying for naturalization.
Why not?
I'll give you an example. A lot of people work on something called a CDD, which means it's a short-term contract. And a lot of people will do their whole career, especially certain immigrant communities will find themselves on these kind of like more precarious contracts. And they'll, live long enough in France to have well established their residency. So, they'll have been here for like 20 years or whatever. But because they don't ever obtain a permanent work contract, the nationality regulation says that you need to prove that you have sufficient and stable resources in order to obtain the nationality. Now, this can be interpreted in different ways, but it's basically come down through the courts that you can refuse, and they usually do, somebody who's on CDD on the basis that they don't have stable resources, even if they make 8,000 euros a month. But you can't refuse someone who works at the supermarket on a permanent contract because even though their actual income is low, it's stable because
that's
it's permanent.
Crazy. I didn't know that worked that way.
And one of the funny things that we'll get into in another episode is actually a lot of these people work for the government. Because there's, generally speaking, no way to get a permanent contract with the government, because if you're on a permanent contract, normally you should be a functionary, which is a special classification. However, if you are not French or from an EU member state, you can't be a functionary. But there's a lot of jobs that need to be done. So what's happened is there are people who will spend their life as a foreigner working for the public service. Now, this could be anything from like serving food at a canteen to doing like real category A, as they call it, administrative jobs. And, they might be earning what, a decent enough salary as a category A functionary might make. And they still don't meet the stable qualification. So
That's wild.
it's one of those weird kind of catch-22s, I think, because if you're one of these people, is it really good advice to quit your job and work at McDonald's, which would get you, I'm not joking, it would get you across the barrier for stable resources.
Yeah, I'd probably do it for a bit just to get the citizenship.
Yeah, but that takes forever. So, if you get fed up at working at McDonald's during that time, of course, you lose the stable aspect.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit more about naturalization in a bit, but let's first keep going through these visas. The next most awarded
residency
permits. Sorry, the next most awarded one, 2023, after student residency permits is familial ones, 91,000.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a really important category because, one, it is, of course, the way a lot of people get into France is through some sort of, or in any country really, through some sort of familial ties. But it is also one for which there is a lot of suspicion, I think, around, and for what I think are, generally speaking, ill-founded conceptions on how these things works. I mean, think of the notion of anchor babies, in the United States. The idea that there's just all these 8-month pregnant women who are coming to the United States and just having a child here or there. Which, by the way, I want to point out, admission in the United States, or as they call it, parole, is something decided at the border, and they if they think you're there for that purpose, they can turn you around. So the idea that this is like a thing and a thing that's happening, I think, is a bit ridiculous, but whatever. But so that, of course, happens in France here too. They say, one guy comes legally the right way, and then suddenly they just bring their entire family with them.
Yeah, no shit. Of course he wants to bring his family with him. I mean, like the idea that someone who comes to work in France legitimately shouldn't have the right to bring their wife, their children, even their mother or whatever, which again is a position that a lot of conservatives hold, is absurd. And this is what some countries do, right? The really evil ones, like the UAE. They don't let you bring your family with you. But God, yeah. Of course it's a massive category, of course. And this is also going to be people who are, came to France as a student or whatever. I mean, you're on effectively this type of permit, right, Patrick?
No, because I am covered by EU law. I am under the EU version of this.
Okay, the same type of thing. Your residency is through your spouse.
Right, exactly. So I was, for people's information, I was a student, but now that I've been married to my wife for a bit, I have switched to the one that's on the basis of her legal residence, which, by the way, you need to show that she does something in France. So she needs to be a student or or in her case, a salaried employee. Now, let's talk about the different reasons that and this is, I think, important because not all countries are as open about this as France. That's not to say that it's easy, by the way, but I just want to point out, I don't think the U.S. has such a wide definition always. Although there are some interesting things that we'll get into in a sec. So the first sort of possibility for family motive is that you are the partner, or I don't think that's the right word, but in French they say conjoint of a French person. So again, this is not me. So what do you need to do if you're the husband or wife of a French person? What do you need to do? You need to not be in a polygamous relationship. This is actually where there's a funny difference between the US. So in France, polygamy is illegal, and as a result, if you are in a polygamous relationship, you cannot bring your wife or husband. And this is different than the United States because the United States says, look, if you're in a polygamous relationship, only the first one has a right to immigration. which I think is very interesting. And, this is a problem because there are people in polygamous relationship. But I think the bigger problem is they actually ask for proof of this usually. So, that can be a pain to get, right? Like you have to go to your own country and demonstrate that, with some document that you're not in a polygamous relationship. And, that's difficult. And I can say for myself, which even though I'm on a different under the EU thing, when I got married to my wife, I also had to prove that I was not in a polygamous relationship. You know what the problem with that is, Liam?
What?
The US does not have a civil registry. So most countries of the civil tradition, which most are, have literally a book that usually, in France, it's like a book in every town hall that kind of like gets transmitted upwards. But most countries have effectively a database somewhere with everyone and their marriages. The US, of course, famously does not, which makes getting yourself into weird illegal situations in the US is easy to do. But it also means that if you want to get married to your wife in France and you're an American, you have to find a way to prove that, which you can't. So it's a roundabout thing that we can talk about on another episode if anyone's interested. But it's kind of fun because, of course, a lot of people don't understand it. They're like, especially because the perception in the US, when you try to explain this to the authorities who the administration itself has dealt with it, but like individual people haven't dealt with it. They're like, come on, are you really telling me that, in their mind, one of the richest, like prosperous countries in the world can't issue a document that says you aren't married to 5 different people? Like to them, it's often inconceivable that could be the case. All right. So there's other conditions too, but like, I think that's like just the main thing to understand. Generally speaking, it's going to be pretty easy if you're married to a French person to bring them to France. Okay. You can also be the foreign parent of a French person. I'm not going to get into the conditions of that, but right. So it could be the parent of someone who has become French. It can be the child of a French person. I'm wondering why that would be the case.
If you got a child in another country.
So this is that's the thing though, because because normally like you would be entitled to this if you are the child of the foreign child of a French person. But actually, this is only about people above the age of 18. Right. I don't want to get into all the details here, but basically, what you need to know is that there's a lot of cases where you could be a child born in France or born abroad who doesn't have French nationality, and 18 is a decisive age for that we can get into in another episode.
Let's skip ahead or jump ahead to the next biggest category, and I think the one that there's the most to say about, which is economic, aka work permits.
Okay, so this is possibly one of the most complicated categories, and I would say the one that depends most on discretion. And I say that because you will hear different things that people say about how this works, right? But then there's also kind of a reality, which is that, just like the United States, France, in the way it has built its economy, needs foreign labor, period. That's just a fact. As I said, there's a lot of public service jobs that are done by people with foreign nationalities. There are, construction anywhere, but it's just as true in France, is often done by foreigners. So, you might hear things like, oh, you need a certain amount of money, you need to be in these kind of certain different jobs. And, there are different sort of categories determined by regulations on this subject. But ultimately, the way this works is, if you are in a certain class of job already and you got an offer and you want to go to France, you can get a visa that allows you to do that. And then when you get here, you will ask for a residency permit. But obviously one of the more common ways of doing this is you come into France for whatever reason, and then you switch to this kind of residence permit. So this is very, as I said, often students. And so if they are offered essentially, or they get a permanent contract, they are supposed to be able to get a residence permit that literally says on it, salaried, like salarié.
You want to see briefly what a permanent contract is? Because this is something that doesn't exist in the US.
So basically the idea is in France, there's kind of 2 types of contracts regarding labor. And there's one by default and one by exception. So the default is an indefinite contract. If you are hired to do a job, you are supposed to, as a matter of default, be employed indefinitely, because most jobs are not temporary. And what that means is that you have certain guarantees towards your employer and vice versa. As a result, the whole French system is based around the notion of an indefinite contract. If you want a bank loan, no problem. If, like to buy a house or something, no problem if you are on a permanent contract, but it's extremely difficult if you are on the exceptional circumstance, which is a temporary contract. And so the labor law, and I don't have it in front of me, but the labor law basically says, okay, but in certain exceptional circumstances, you can use a temporary contract. I think this is usually supposed to be for one of your employees is unavailable for 6 months for whatever reason, so you can essentially hire help to fill their shoes while they're gone. But what you're not supposed to be able to do is do something with a temporary contract that a permanent employee would normally be doing. Unfortunately, this no longer kind of reflects the reality of the French labor market, because increasingly CDDs, as they're called, temporary labor contracts, are becoming increasingly common. And as I said, in the public sector, which operates on a completely different legal regime, where CDDs were supposed to be 1% of employment, is now, I think it's almost up to 30% of the public service is made up of people working on CDDs. And they are actually, I would say, subject to less scrutiny as to the legitimacy of putting someone on a CDD than the private sector is. So if you have a permanent contract, if you have a permanent salaried work contract, then you can ask for a residency permit on that basis. And that requires you first asking for what's called a work authorization. And this can be easy to hard depending on circumstances. This is delivered by your local prefecture. I've had this done once. In my case, it was it took 24 hours or whatever. It was all digital, and I didn't even do it. It was the employer who did it. So, the job I was working at was paid below what the passport talent would be. So it is a. I just want to say that getting a work authorization, which then gets you access to this type of residency permit, actually can be pretty easy, right? They'll talk about how the employer needs to prove that they can't find a French person to do the job. They can't find an EU person to do the job. It's really exceptional. But again, the reality of things is France needs employment. France needs people to do things.
So does the US, and yet.
Yeah, well, so the funny thing, I wouldn't say the funny thing, the interesting, I guess, anecdote that also hides an unfortunate reality is that the US has a lot of incentive to have people on illegal statuses, because employers employers love that, and the ones who are intentionally doing that, right? And the state gets a lot of benefit out of it, right? Because people pay their taxes and they get no benefits. That's not the case in France, because in France, the issue is if you are working illegally, you and your employer, but I would put emphasis on the employer, are defrauding the social service system, because your employer is not paying for your healthcare, they're not paying for your retirement, they're not paying for all the things that make it so that your salary at the end of the month is a bit less than what your gross income is, because healthcare and all that stuff costs a lot of money. And so there's actually, to some extent, an incentive. If these people are going to be working, you should give them legal status. Not only for cynical reasons, because otherwise these social services would collapse.
Overall, this is just hugely different from the US. Basically, like you said, it comes down to if an employer wants to give you a job with a permanent contract, you can get a work permit for that.
Not only that, if you're on a temporary contract, if you're a salaried employee on a salaried activity on a temporary work contract, you can also get a residency permit. It'll just say, instead of saying salaried on the card, it will say temporary worker.
This is part of the reason why, if you come to France as a student, as we were saying, it can be very easy to stay after, if you get offered a job, of course. But in the US, it's not like that at all. We don't want to go into the details here, and I don't think we know them very well. But in the US, I have many friends who are foreigners in the US and have been in this position, and I don't think anyone I know has successfully gotten a work permit in the US. It's just very difficult. There's that whole lottery system, which is crazy. the exception to that is, what is the visas called that all the tech workers get? The H-1B visas.
Yeah.
The ones that are really mostly just given to people who work for the large tech companies. But otherwise, to try to get a normal job in the US, it's very rare. Very rare, even if they want you.
Do you want to know what the conditions are for getting the work authorization, which again is the essential piece that you need to get a job in France as a foreigner?
Yeah, so I would guess there's a salary requirement.
Okay, so basically the idea with a work authorization is that once an employer has decided to take you on, they will ask for work authorization from the local prefecture. In order for that to be successful, it will depend on whether or not, say, you have a master's degree, you're on the residency permit I mentioned earlier, which is the searching for work or creating a company one, or whether you're a student, doesn't matter. The basic idea is that, there's different criteria that, depending on your circumstances, you need to meet in order to successfully get a work authorization or be successfully given a work authorization. However, there is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, which is that there's a big exception to either salary or educational requirements, which is being in a profession which is, quote, in tension, basically meaning where there's a lot of demand. The way you know whether or not the job you're looking at is one of those is that there is a regulatory document published. In this case, the most recent one is from the 21st of May, 2025, that basically says what these jobs are and in what areas, because they kind of divide it based on region. So let me give you some examples. And I think this is what people find a bit surprising. If you are in, let's say, where should I do, Liam? Where are you interested in working?
Let's say Occitanie.
Occitanie. If you are working in, and I'm only just going to give a few because the list is pretty long, but if you are in any of the following professions, that's it. If the job is this, you don't need to necessarily show that you're qualified. So agents of building maintenance, building maintenance men are part of this list. Salaried farmers, agriculture, agriculteur.
Salaried farmers?
Yeah, people who help with at home, home help, people who help take care of someone at home, or also nurses, home nurses are also part of that. People who help in the kitchen, people who are learning to become chefs, basically, or working in the restaurant business. Other types of unqualified industrial labor. What do you call boucher in English? Butchers.
Yeah. So your point is there's lots of different industries. It's not just tech or some crap like that.
Well, listen to this one, for example. If you work in the hotel industry, that's it. If you're employed in a hotel, that counts. Which I think is interesting, right? Because if you compare it to the US, that's what all these people are working in, but they're not allowed to do it legally.
Right. And that's right. Like you said, that's why we have so many illegal immigrants in the US, because our country is dependent on immigration, like all advanced Western economies, and we just don't allow it. We don't make it as easy to get residency for working as it is in France and is in many European countries. And the result is not that we have less immigrants. In fact, we have a higher percentage of people born abroad than in France. They just are forced to be there illegally, effectively. So the two other major categories of residencies in France, because I think that one of them isn't technically titre séjour, are refugees and people on humanitarian permits, which is a different thing, though I'm not sure how. Do you know?
Okay, so let's start with the humanitarian stuff. Basically, if you are a foreigner victim of human trafficking, pimping, or engaged in a way out of prostitution, to use the terms of the regulatory text, then you may be eligible for a residency permit on that basis. So that's one possibility. And I don't have much experience or knowledge, frankly, about these specifically, how it works in practice, but just looking here at the regulation, I see that it starts by saying, well, if the police or gendarmerie provide elements about this foreigner who is a victim of these infractions, that's one of the ways of getting this all started. So, I don't know how that works in reality, for example. Then the other hypothesis, or the other possibility for getting this kind of residency permit, is the foreigner whose state of health requires a certain medical treatment. I especially don't know how that one works in practice. So maybe we'll have to leave that for another episode if people are interested.
And then actual refugees, there were 45,000 residencies granted for that in 2023, which isn't considered a residency permit, right? It's not the same thing. It's a different status under the law.
So refugees basically is a recognition of someone fleeing their country for a reason that's protected under international law. And if you are recognized as a refugee, then you get a residency card, which is basically a permanent residency card. Like that's where a lot of the confusion comes in, because in French it's carte de résident, and that's valid for 10 years. And so this is after you have submitted basically your file that justifies that you are in fact under international law a refugee. So this could be fleeing a conflict, persecution, etc. In practice, this can be difficult to obtain because, you're reliant on authorities essentially considering whether or not you meet these standards.
And they can be quite strict, the standards, right?
Yeah, and they can kind of be subjective, right? Like I think one of the issues is that like circumstances that in one case would give way to refugee status might not in another. Kind of things like, oh, well, sure, this is happening in the region you live in, but you could have moved to the, somewhere else, which, yeah. There's also, like, for example, if you're being like persecuted for your, let's say you're being persecuted for the fact that you are gay, you have to kind of like prove that. And because, especially when you're talking about like cross-border kind of things, like how do you prove that, right? Like it might not be so easy to like go and get a police report and say that like you were stabbed because you were gay, because the police might not agree that's why you were stabbed, or they might think it, who knows? They might think it's fine. So how do you like produce that proof is kind of a thing. And they can be pretty stringent about what that means. Another thing is that and this is kind of just an interesting nuance of the international law on this, is like you actually don't need. This is very rare that you would get this in this basis. But for example, if society perceived you as gay, but you're not actually gay, if you were persecuted just as well, technically that should meet the standard under international law. But good luck arguing that in practice, I think. But the thing is, a lot of people don't meet the requirement of being a refugee for various reasons. So if that's the case, you are entitled or potentially entitled to something called subsidiary protection. And in that case, you get a residency permit of 4 years. But
yeah, the outcome of this is that the numbers I'm looking at are showing that usually less than half of like people who apply every year are accepted.
Yeah, and it can be pretty chilling. I think you can, especially if you're not in this world, you can just hear some of the stories and be like, how is that not recognized? And sometimes there's a legal reason for it, and other times you might feel that like it feels a bit kind of arbitrary. And one of the interesting things is that because this asylum, basically the asylum system is one, subject to international law, and there's just honestly so many cases, like a huge caseload. This is actually not in the normal administrative court system. So basically, normally you would go to an administrative court if you wanted to challenge say a préfet or a prefect who denies, your residency permit. But if it's about asylum, it's first going to be a special office called the OFPRA, which will, maybe deny your request for or your demand for asylum. And then if you appeal that, you have to go to the CNDA, which is a special asylum court. And then if you are still refused there's nowhere else to go except the Council of State, so the highest court in the land for the administrative jurisdiction.
We could do a whole episode about refugees and refugees in Europe, but I just wanted to point out that like people have a crazy idea of how big of a thing this is. There are many, many refugees in the world. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, estimates that there are about 122 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, of which 38 million are outside of their home country, aka are refugees, compared to 68 million who are internally displaced. But the vast majority of those, over 71%, are in low and middle income countries. they're in countries like Iran or Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon or Uganda. They're not in Europe. They're in countries that are much worse equipped to handle them than Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we said, like, you know, I never make the practical argument for immigration because I think it ignored the more important one, which is a humanitarian one. But if you're one of those people, I mean, like, yeah, it's either you have to admit it's an economic thing, not the necessarily being a refugee, but like the idea that you need people to do work. You know, if you accept that premise, then I don't know why people are always up in arms about, you know, refugees. I mean, you get to do some good by awarding something that is considered important under international law, and you get the advantage of, you know, economic activity and people who are ready and willing to do the jobs that need to be done. Again, not the argument I bring up, but it's one that, at least where you can see a lot of contradiction in the people who are kind of like have a double discourse on this kind of thing.
Okay, so we mentioned earlier that it's relatively easy in France, certainly compared to the US, also compared to a lot of other European countries, to naturalize, aka to become a French citizen after a period of residency there. But let's talk about how that actually works, Patrick. So what are the general requirements to become naturalized as a French citizen?
Right. So naturalization is a big topic, and we're only going to scratch the surface here. So if I left some things out, that was intentional. But essentially, if you're looking at becoming naturalized as a French citizen, say because you studied here and now work in France, for example, you're looking at something called naturalisation par décret. This essentially means that you fit in a category that allows you to ask for French nationality. And so typically this would be after 5 years of living in France that you can even consider attempting to naturalize as a French citizen. However, the French law provides for an interesting kind of exception to that, which is if you have a degree from a higher education institution. So, for example, if you have successfully completed 2 years of higher education studies that results in the obtainment of a diploma or successfully going on to an additional year, you are not required to have lived in France for those 5 years that normally you would have needed to do in order to apply for nationality. This rule of 5 years is also not the case for people who have been recognized as refugees. And also, if you come from a country where one of the official languages is French and you were educated in a French establishment, like a French educational establishment, you know, say you did high school at a lycée français, like a French high school that, you know, you'll find these all around the world, then also you do not have the 5-year requirement. So that all sounds really good. You're thinking, oh, I'm just going to move to France, do 2 years of a bachelor's degree, and apply for nationality. Well, you're going to find out that that's not quite how it works because there are additional requirements. So one of them is that you need to demonstrate that you have assimilated to the French community. This includes knowing the language, the history, the culture, as well as, you know, kind of like civic duties and that kind of thing. Like, you know, what's the motto of France, for example? What are the values of the Republic? That kind of thing. So as I said, we have the requirement of having lived in France for a certain amount of time, unless you've done 2 years of higher education successfully in France. You need to show that you've assimilated to the French community, that you speak French. But finally, and here's where there's a lot of difficulties for people who actually try to do this in practice, you need to show that you have done what's called insertion professionnelle, which means that you have essentially joined the working community, if you will. And the way you do this, according to the law, is that you need to show that you have income, which is both stable and sufficient. Not only is it about whether or not you have enough income for yourself, but whether or not you have enough income for your household. So this can be kind of difficult because, if you have a big household, the prefect, who's going to be deciding on your application, can be like, well, you have like 10 kids, so it's not enough that you make 3 times minimum wage, for example. And the other issue, and I think I evoked this earlier, the notion of these income or this income being stable is a point of difficulty because a lot of people find themselves doing an entire career sometimes on temporary contracts, like contracts of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 months, whatever, right? But unfortunately, at least in the current state of the jurisprudence, the prefect can deny you your application on the basis that you do not have stable or sufficient income, even if you are working on temporary contracts of 3 years, making $4,000 a month, for example. So that's probably one of the biggest problems that people have, and it's also why the 2 years aspect doesn't always make a lot of sense, because it's like, oh, well, sure, you can apply for nationality after only 2 years of bachelor's, but unless you have a permanent contract, which a lot of people don't because they're going to be doing more studies, you can't apply yet. So I certainly haven't heard of anyone actually doing only 2 years of studies and then.
I was about to ask if you actually knew anyone who did that, because everyone I know who's done it has waited a lot longer after their eligibility just because they had heard things and didn't want to get rejected. Yeah. Maybe it looks bad if you get rejected and then you then want to apply again. That probably makes it more difficult. But let's be clear. This is a pretty permissive nationality regime, globally speaking. Also, the level of French required is currently a B1, which is, for people who don't know that classification scheme, that is not a high level of competency. Like, I think most university courses in France ask for a B2, the next level up, before you can study in French. So you can technically, I don't know how this would work in practice in the interview if your French is only at a B1 level, but you could get French citizenship with a level of French that doesn't allow you to study in French universities. In French, I mean. And also the fact that there is any requirement as low as 2 years is quite remarkable. There are few countries in the world that have a requirement that low. Even 5 years, the normal requirement, is on the lower side. That's the standard for quite a bit of Europe now, especially since Germany lowered theirs to 5 years last year. But that's quite good. The US requirement is also 5 years before you can apply for naturalization, but that's 5 years of having a green card. It's 5 years of being a permanent resident. So that means that effectively most people who are applying have been a resident of the US for much longer than 5 years. Whereas France, that's 5 years, not of permanent residency, but 5 years just of any residency, including being a student. Also, France has very permissive dual nationality laws. No restrictions on that as far as I know, which the US also does, but lots of countries in the world, lots of countries in Europe, like Spain, the Netherlands, or Austria, for example, are quite restrictive about dual nationality.
And so some of this stuff has changed a little bit recently. So there's been the Minister of Interior, the new one, they change all the time these days, Bruno Retailleau.
Yeah, who we talked about on our episode about the new French government a couple months ago. We talked about how this guy is quite hard right.
Yeah, and so he signed something that's called a circulaire, which is basically an instruction to those under him, so prefects, that is supposed to respond to the perception that there is a problem with immigration in France. So this circulaire that's named after him, the Circulaire Retailleau, does a couple things, but one of the things is, he's informing, or he is telling prefects to pay a particular attention to the level of integration of a foreigner before essentially giving them nationality. It kind of implies that they want a higher level of French. I think I'm looking at the circular right now. I don't see it, but I've seen it reported as they're asking for B2 level of French.
We're going to start asking for a B2 starting in 2026.
Yeah, so he says, in order to ensure an effective integration, a particular attention must be brought to the question of the level of mastery of the French language by people asking for nationality. And another aspect of this is also regarding what it means to show like that you have an insertion professionnelle, because in the law it's actually pretty like lax, or it's pretty imprecise as to what that means. So as I said, like the jurisprudence has tended to say, okay, like CDI, CDI is sufficient for showing it, regardless of how much you make usually. But here in the Circulaire Taillot, we see that they're trying to make it stricter, but they do specifically allow for CDDs, which is a change, at least in on its face. So you can have if you can show like you've had multiple CDDs for 2 years, they're claiming that this is one way that someone could actually show stable and sufficient resources. So in that way, it sounds good. But they are saying though that you do in fact need to show that you have a salary equivalent to the minimum wage, which you might be thinking, oh, that's pretty reasonable. And the problem is that doesn't kind of account for people working part-time, at least as far as I know, because I think they're asking in order for them to consider it sufficient, your income, they want to see that it's minimum wage at the monthly rate. So that can be a problem because there's a lot of people who work half time while their significant other, for example, maybe does work full time. So and that's a problem because even though they ask you to show that you have the resources for your whole household, ironically, the other way doesn't usually work either, or it doesn't work the other way. So if you, for example, if I'm not working, but my wife is, she has to show that she can support me financially in order to get French citizenship or to become naturalized as a French citizen. But it doesn't work the other way around where I can apply and say, hey, look, my wife has enough for the whole household, so I don't need to work. So it's kind of one of those things where it can be really difficult, especially if you have someone who is, potentially handicapped, but isn't recognized as such under the law, meaning they're not sufficiently so that they can essentially get around this obligation, or they just haven't gotten it recognized officially, like administratively. That can be a problem there. But you also have people who've lived long enough in France that like they fill all the conditions, but now they're old enough that they're on retirement, and thus they're no longer on a permanent contract. They no longer have income that is necessarily considered stable and sufficient. So all that's to say, that there's kind of a lot of difficulty around some of the criteria here. But not only that fundamentally the idea of naturalization, the courts have always recognized, and I think this is probably true pretty much everywhere, is that at the end of the day, courts exercise relatively very little checks on these kinds of things and tend to trust the administration on these kinds of matters and consider it that it's like not a right to access French nationality, even if you meet all the conditions or all the criteria. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of like a discretionary state function, and that can make it really difficult because even if you do meet the criteria and say you find yourself nonetheless rejected, I don't believe that challenging that in a court is generally going to be kind of an effective recourse for you. So it is just one of those things where the administration, the state has a lot of power, and you just gotta hope and pray.
However, I want to say again that this is still one of the most permissive citizenship regimes, certainly in Europe. And I say permissive, that makes it sound like I think it's a bad thing. I don't. I think it's a very good thing. I think it should be more permissive. I think if you live in a country, you should have the right to stay there, and you should be a citizen of that country very easily. And obviously the right, especially the far right, does not think this. And so the way that French citizenship law is, certainly that it's a lot more liberal than many of its neighbors, especially Southern European countries, also Eastern European countries, as you can imagine. But even like Germany has more restrictive laws, Netherlands has more restrictive laws. But this has been under attack for years by Le Pen, by all the far right, and many of the mainstream right who want to make it so that you have to live longer. You have to prove more integration to French society, whatever that means, because that's a very nebulous concept, if you ask me. And also Le Pen has repeatedly attacked dual citizenship,
which France is very permissive on, to add.
Yes. Yeah. There's not really any restrictions. And a lot of European countries do restrict it, or restrict it only to certain countries. That's the case with Spain, for example. As far as I understand, if I were to get naturalized here, first of all, I'd have to wait 10 years. And secondly, the US is not one of the countries that has an agreement with Spain, where Spain allows dual nationality with the US. And that's, again, true of a number of European countries. But of course, it's not the US that Le Pen would like to be targeting. They'd more want to be targeting, people, dual loyalty countries, that you can't possibly be a citizen of both Syria and France or whatever, stuff like that. You can imagine the reasons that they say that this shouldn't be allowed.
I take a very, honestly, Republican position on this kind of thing. Like, to me, naturalization, like, what does it mean to become French? I mean, you know, who am I to say? But like, as someone who believes in kind of this Republican conceptualization of the nation state, I think believing in a democratic Republican system is probably just for me at least, is just the floor, right? Like that's what makes you French. Because like the idea of French identity, like, you know, as being something, you know, as speaking French, I think, you know, there's maybe an aspect to that, but fundamentally it's like, do you subscribe to the values of the Republic? And I mean, not the values of the Republic the way some people mean that, but I mean, you know, I mean the real ones. I think if you're a Jacobin, you are French, or you should be considered French. I
don't really agree with that, but that's a very French ideology that's seeped into you.
No, but what I mean by that is that, for example, I think it's anti-Republican to discriminate, for example, on the basis of your religious beliefs, for example.
There's another aspect of nationality law where France is, I would say, not as liberal or permissive, or however you want to put it, as the US, and that is birthright citizenship, or jus soli, which is like the principle that if you're born on American territory, irrespective of your parent status, irrespective of anything, you automatically get American citizenship. And this idea of jus soli is something that is almost exclusively restricted to the Americas. Pretty much every American country, every country in the Americas, you know, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, etc., have this principle where there's unconditional birthright citizenship. France and other European countries don't have that. And this means that, I'm sure you can tell us about the details of how this works, Patrick, and that it's not as bad as it sounds, but this does mean, for example, that there are 812,000 people who are born in France and do not currently have French nationality and live in France, to be clear, not people who don't live in France. That's a pretty high number of people.
Basically, if you go online, you'll find that, yeah, people will divide countries into jus soli and jus sanguis, however you want to sanguinis, however you want to pronounce that. And it's not very useful of a distinction, because it kind of implies that like most systems that operate on the basis of right, like blood right, generally have a way of acquiring citizenship on the basis of where you were born, or at least where you live. Now, France, for example, the way it works is, yeah, if you're born in France to non-French parents, you will essentially, if you live in France and do your schooling here, you will have the option at 18 essentially to opt for the French nationality. And in the meantime, you'll get like a residency card, a very special one that allows you to, that justifies that you are in this situation.
Are you at risk of being deported as a child in that situation?
I don't know. So it's kind of like this. I would say I don't know if this is entirely true, but I would say it's almost like kind of this odd Republican thing, actually, of like, because you aren't French by blood, we'll give you the permission to be here, of course. And then once you are ready, quote unquote, and you're enlightened as an adult, you can choose whether or not you are French, essentially, which it's kind of an odd concept, and it's very impractical for people in those situations.
Right. I mean, I agree that the distinction is not as relevant as it seems to be, and that it does effectively bring most people who are born in France into being citizens in the same way as they are in the US. But it's kind of an interesting distinction. Of course, that right, birthright citizenship, has been under perennial attack by the right in the US, and maybe they'll get rid of it someday.
Yeah, and I think I honestly think the birthright thing, like if we in a vacuum were talking about this issue, I kind of feel like the way it should work is like you're by default, wherever you're born, citizen of that country, just to make things easier.
But in a sense, it's silly, I suppose, that, for example, Boris Johnson was an American citizen until he forfeited it just because his parents happened to be like working in the US at the time. I don't mean people get like, or like you can be a tourist and get, again, I don't care. Like, I don't care about restricting American citizenship, but
it's true. But like in a vacuum, there's solutions to that. You could say like, you could just say you are birthright citizenship by default, but if you have a second nationality and you don't spend more than 1 year post-birth in that country, then you lose the other one. But realistically, I think the thing is imagine you're, say, Boris Johnson, and your parents were working in the US at the time, and then they stay there for 3 more years after, or hell, maybe even 10 years after, and you feel American because you've been living in the United States up until the age of 10, and then you move back to the UK. Like, why should you have no right to come back? I feel like,
No,
it's like part of your
completely agree.
childhood. So
Yeah, I completely agree. But I would say the same in France. And you could,
absolutely, yeah.
if you lived in France up to the age of 10, you leave, you would by default not have the right to be a French citizen, right? Also, can you imagine the impracticality of if they got rid of that in the US? Just think about, like, what is the number one way that people prove they're citizens in the US?
Birth certificate.
Birth certificate, right. In France, you don't have to prove you're a citizen. The state knows if you're a citizen. Of course, we don't operate like that in the US. The government doesn't automatically know that you are a citizen. They don't have a registry of citizens. Citizenship is kind of a nebulous concept. And if you're someone who's never had a passport because you've never left the country, which is a lot of people, then you, first of all, never had to prove you're a citizen. But if you did have to prove it, yeah, your birth certificate, that just shows that you're a citizen. And you could technically have an American birth certificate without being a citizen, but only if you've forfeited your citizenship. But yeah, that would be just a huge administrative mess, which, I mean, they might like that at this, given the way things are currently going in the US.
But don't worry, Palantir will figure it out.
Right. But they would love that if it was much harder to, like, prove that you're a citizen because a birth certificate didn't automatically show that you're a citizen. Okay, so we've been mainly talking about the theory here, Patrick, but why don't you talk about what it's like in practice, especially how it's been for you as someone who has been on a permit in France for quite a long time now. How long have it's been? 8 years? Or?
Yeah, it's been since 2016.
9 years. So let's talk about what it's like in practice. You've lived in 4 different departments. Won't say which ones, but what is it like in practice when you have to deal with the immigration authorities with your residence permit?
Right. So first of all, the something I just want to highlight is that the actual immigration authorities that you have to deal with can actually vary depending on your status. So especially people who are coming as refugees, they have to deal with, or they have to work with the OFPRA, which I never have to confront because it's just not part of my process. And so they have kind of other requirements. I know, like, often there's like a medical exam involved with that. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I just want to say that, like, my experience is not everyone's. Nonetheless, if you're wondering about students or, family, that kind of stuff, I've kind of lived that. When I first moved to France, I was in a non-Parisian region department, and there's kind of a lot of rumors about, like, which department is the best to be in, because each prefecture is different. They have different staffing levels, and
which it shouldn't be. I want to interrupt to say that it shouldn't be, based on sort of the basic principles of the French Republic that we've talked about a number of times. This is the kind of thing that should be equal everywhere, because it's not up to the discretion of your local government like it is in, say, Germany, for example. In Germany, it's actually a state level decision. Same in Switzerland, I believe, a canton level decision. In France, it's a national government. This is all, in theory, the decision of the Ministry of the Interior, right?
Right, delegated to the prefect.
But in practice...
Right, the laws are all the same. In theory, everything should be the same. But, there's also an aspect of centralization, which is that you can almost create inequality through equality. So, for example, imagine you were going to create a prefecture on an empty island, or an island with, like, 4 inhabitants. How would you do it? You would be like, well, all prefectures must have a minimum of 50 staff members or whatever. I don't know if there's any actual number, but, like, when you're conceiving of it, you'll be like 50 staff members. We need to have, a head of immigration, or the head of the foreigners office, and then you need to have heads of the sub offices, like the people under them, and right. So you build like the minimal scaffolding of a prefecture on a nearly vacant island looks like a prefecture in somewhere that's a lot more populated. So that's one area where you can create this kind of thing of, like, you can have maybe a department with very few immigrants, but surprisingly, because the basic minimal service requires a certain number of people, you actually have a relatively high per capita staff available. But you also have the fact that préfet, the prefect, has policies, right? They are supposed to implement the will of the state in the department, but they have a lot of discretion. And there's probably nothing more discretionary than immigration generally. Doesn't matter what country you're in, that's usually the case.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of politics involved. The prefecture de police, for example, is the Paris prefecture. You don't call it the Paris prefecture, you call it the prefecture de police. We can talk about that on another episode. And before anyone mentions it, there's no such thing as a prefecture de police outside of Paris. There was a prefect who tried to call himself the prefecture de police of non-Paris, and he was quickly told to stop. So that's a very high political position. So you can imagine that when that guy gets appointed, he's going to be more in line with the values or the policies of the president than someone in a department, far off that's not considered very prestigious. And so that guy might just be like, not politically aligned with the president. So this can lead to just so many different kind of discrepancies, I would say, between departments. But then there's some things that are kind of, unfortunately, all the same everywhere. Now, when I first moved to France, I was in a non-Parisian department, and honestly, things were pretty good. I remember, for example, my first residency permit, the kind of way it works is, you bring your application there. When my visa that had the residency permit visa having value of a residency permit was expiring, I went to the prefecture. I did my application in person, right? Like I bring a bunch of documents. They tell you what you're missing. You come back, etc. It was pretty chill. And then a few weeks later in the mail, I got a letter saying, hey, it doesn't matter what you're doing next month on this day at this time, you are being summoned to the prefecture. And I show up, I'm invited by a very nice lady into her room. She, just does the basic stuff. She's happy typing on her computer away, and I walk away, everything's all set. I have my card, and everything's great.
Idyllic, semi-rural France.
And at that time, you actually had to show up with what are called stamps. Yeah, there was a stamp tax.
Yeah.
And they're literally stamps that you buy at a local tobacco store, which are allowed to operate because the government licenses them. It's a whole thing. We can get to it on another episode. But kind of old-timey, very paper, it was a pain because all these kinds of things are. But overall, pretty smooth, pretty good. Then as I moved to the Parisian region, things got a bit more complicated. And that's not just because the Parisian region, which obviously is where a lot of immigrants in France are, but also because we were living through the period of what in France they call dematerialization, meaning they were moving from doing everything on paper to digitizing things. And I think our listeners will, can definitely find experience in their life with this kind of thing. Sometimes when you digitize something, you take advantage of all the power computers have to make life easier on people, and other times, you kind of get sometimes that more haphazard approach to digitalization that can actually make things a bit harder than they used to be. And so one of the things is that, I told you, Liam, just now, how I got this letter in the mail summoning me to the prefecture. And so one of the things that they did is they said, well, let's get rid of that system and switch to an appointment system. So you connect to their website and you get an appointment and everything's nice. But I think, as everyone knows about appointment systems generally that operate like this, like check your RMV if they have this, you'll see what I mean. Yeah, there's usually no appointments.
Classic.
And so, yeah, my experience in Paris was, you had to connect, like every day, and there's no appointments. And there's even websites that try and scam you into paying money for them to get you an appointment or to them to alert you when one's available. And what they're doing there is they're essentially using bots to grab appointments. Now, what's the problem with that? No one's as fast as a bot. So either you pay these, scammers who will charge you $20 a month to get an appointment at the prefecture, or your residency permit expires and you haven't been able to pick up your old card. Now, normally this wouldn't be a problem because normally you could go to the prefecture and apply for a new card, right? Say, sure, I haven't picked up my card because I haven't gotten an appointment, but I would like to apply for a new I would like to renew it nonetheless. And at least there you could have talked to a person and they could have been like, oh, well, let's figure this out, right? The way it works now is that you have to do that online. And the online system prevents you from asking for a renewal so long as you have not picked up your residency permit. So just the mere fact of switching to this system has made it absolutely incredibly difficult to get your residency permit. And what used to just be like, hey, you got to tell your boss or skip a class because the prefect summoned you at an inconvenient hour, has gone to, okay, this is going to take you several weeks, months to get an appointment. And then, you have to show up and wait in an extremely long line, and it can be quite complicated. And then nothing got worse than, in terms of my experience at least, than when I moved outside of Paris and into a Paris suburb.
Big mistake. You moved to the problem department, the department that is like the focus of like the French rights ire as being, the immigration heavy department, the social problems department. Exactly the kind of place where the minister of the interior would say, hey, try to tighten things up here, right?
Right, that's right. And I think I think what an aspect of this I find a little bit hesitant to talk about, or I just want to be careful about, because I do mean this sincerely. There is a serious issue with the fact that the people who work in these jobs obviously find it very stressful and difficult to manage, and understandably so. I mean, when you have, and this is a classic thing that's happening, and it happened 30 years ago. It started 30 years ago in the U.S., and its effects in France are kind of only being felt now, which is that like as you reduce the number of staff working in these kinds of jobs, those jobs become a lot harder to work and a lot harder to recruit for. And so, for example, if you follow some of the Parisian prefectures on, say, LinkedIn or whatever, you can watch as how every couple months they are trying to recruit for like a really important immigration related job. And it's just like turnover, people are constantly leaving because, they either don't find it very fulfilling to be, dealing with 100 applications a day, or giving 100 cards a day, or rejecting people that they don't feel should be rejected. So, you have kind of, I think, the combination of just like a lot of this stuff being digitized, and that making it harder for everyone, including the prefecture staff, and, also policy changing towards trying to make it maybe more difficult for immigrants.
I want to say, for anyone who thinks that sounds really bad, what Patrick's saying now, this sort of hassle, talk to anyone who's been through a similar procedure in the US, because again, I don't know much about the details of the system in the US, but I have a number of friends who are non-citizens living in the US, and they have all had a hell of a time. Administrative hassles, headaches, bizarre rules that make the French situation look trivial. But on the other hand, I want to say to anyone who's listening who is on a visa in Spain, on a residence permit in Spain, like me, stop complaining. It's not better in other European countries.
That's actually funny that you bring up Spain, Liam, because I lived in Spain at one point and had to go through, I wasn't there for that long, so I only got to experience a certain aspect of it. But when I moved to France, I was like, wow, this is so much better than Spain, honestly. Because, honestly, in Spain, it was fine, but like, the whole going to the police station and like, I don't know, it was a bit opaque how it all worked and everything. And so like France at first felt like, wow, they have this kind of done a lot better. But now I look back on it and I think, yeah, my experience in Spain like was overall better, especially because at least at the time they didn't have this dematerialization problem that I think this is true everywhere. Administrations that try to dematerialize without like a cohesive, strong, centralized strategy will always fail. And, we can theorize as to why, right? I mean, there's many reasons.
I think it's also gotten worse in France since we were first there as students back in 2016 for you, 2017 for me. I mean, I remember when we first applied for student visas, to be clear, in the US, we had to go to the French consulate. And they later changed that to now it's being handled by a private company that also does lots of different countries. And they do a much worse job. And, shocking.
And as a Republican, I find this kind of stuff very, very unfortunate, because like, what's more Republican than walking into a French consulate and like a French flag hanging above and a nice civil servant lady saying, we're in the United States, but she nonetheless says, bonjour, right? And like, like nothing is more French Republican than that. And that when something, they can tell you what's wrong with your, application and tell you to go make photocopies down the hall. But when you externalize it to something like, what's it called, VFS?
I think you're right. It's VFS, and they do this for like dozens of different European countries. And I remember when you were applying for a new visa when you were moving back to France, when they just started using this. And I remember you called the helpline and they were like, press 1 for Sweden, 2 for Denmark, whatever. And France wasn't an option because they just hadn't added that yet. Like, it's classic. You know, things are outsourced or to a private contractor that does a worse job. I don't know if they do it cheaper. I'd be surprised.
I remember going to VFS for my French visa. Now, look, I love Latinos, okay? It's awesome. But if you are a French Republican, how are you okay with a fundamental, like, state prerogative service being managed by a guy I was speaking to in Spanish who doesn't speak
I had the
any
same
French?
experience.
I'm like, what? Yeah. What is going on here? Like, I mean, like, you know, good for this guy, although probably not, because he didn't seem very happy in the job either. So
I'm sure it's a terrible job. It probably pays terribly. Also because these people are not, I mean, it's so silly because you go there and, like, again, you used to be able to go to the French consulate, and as you said, you could ask them, like, oh, is this how this works? And they were people who work at the French consulate. And so, I mean, they might not know, but they're familiar with the subject. And then this outsourcing, like, they had all signs everywhere saying, don't ask us any questions. Yes. We don't know. Like, and they do it for tons of different countries. Their job is just to, like,
they mail it to the embassy.
You hand them the things and they mail it.
So for France, I believe they mailed it to the Washington, D.C. French embassy instead of the Boston consulate, which still exists.
And it's not like they closed the Boston consulate. I mean, maybe they laid off the people who were doing that. Like, I don't know. Anyway, classic enshittification of government services, not just an American phenomenon, very much also something that happens in every European country. No, but I actually, the Spain thing was a tangent, but I wanted to bring that up just to say that it really annoys me here that both people who are from here and also people who have moved here and are on visas tend to assume that things sucking is because, oh, Spain's so inefficient, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, with these things, it's a mentality where, you know, occasionally it's true, but I'm like, I especially hate when people say, oh, yeah, in like a Northern European country, I don't know, France, Britain, Germany, it'd be so much better. I'm like, no, because I've been on I've been on residence permits in France and in Britain. And okay, personally, I didn't have any bad experiences, but like, it wasn't significantly easier. And I've heard much worse experiences than people have here. Like, it's very difficult to get an appointment in Barcelona, like you were saying in Paris. However, you're allowed to do it anywhere in the province of Barcelona, which is huge. So it's actually quite easy to get appointments in places that you have to go on the train for 30 minutes to, which, yeah, that sucks. That's not how it should be. But it's way better than, like, there is no possible way to get an appointment, as you were saying. And then also, like, I have not been in a visa or a residence permit in Germany, but I know lots of people have had, and their stories make that sound like the worst place. Like, Germany has bureaucracy that makes France and Spain look very smooth functioning. So this is the kind of thing where I don't know. I haven't heard anyone tell me, oh, I had a great immigration experience somewhere. I had so much fun doing my procedures. Now, is it easy in Switzerland or Estonia or Finland or something? Maybe, I don't know.
Definitely not Switzerland.
It's bad everywhere. Oh, no, you're right. Yeah, because there it's done by the canton. And some of the cantons are really racist. It probably depends where you are. But I would say, if you're thinking about moving to France, we've talked about doing an episode sometime in the near future about how that works, sort of more on like an not individual, but on like an advice level. Like, how can you do it? Don't be put off. Honestly, living in another country is great, and a great experience that probably I think most people should have. And you know what? It's a great time to look into it. And if you're living in the US, and immigration procedures are terrible everywhere. But sort of just in my experience, again, this is not the experience for someone who's been an immigrant from a poor, demonized country has a much worse time. But in my experience, it's mostly been a pain in the way that any sort of bureaucracy, public or private, by the way, people don't complain about private bureaucracy enough, but in my experience, that's just as annoying as public bureaucracy. Bureaucracy just sucks. And it's just annoying and stressful. Obviously, it's stressful to like have your residency in question and not have your residence card and all these things.
Yeah, and I would point out that private bureaucracy, I think one of the things people miss is that they've never actually experienced private bureaucracy for things that matter. you know, when it's like, you're like, wow, Google's so good. Like, you know, it's so easy to create an account, like all these things. It's like, yes, but you haven't seen what happens when they're trying to like give you a passport, because if they refuse your passport, you'll have absolutely no way of getting in touch with anyone ever. Whereas at least there still is a prefecture. They make it hard to get into sometimes, but at least there is one, you know, like you can find it.
Yeah. But I mean, also, I think everyone's had bad experience with private bureaucrancy. Your bank, your electricity, your shitty electricity
right. But
monopoly,
you can move
if you
from
live in
those.
the US, like,
right, you can switch banks, you can switch electricity providers. You can't switch
in the US. You can't always switch electricity providers or internet providers, for example, and everyone hates those companies. I mean,
that's true. That's fair.
You could say, oh, that's just because they're a monopoly. If you're sort of a libertarian.
Well,
type.
it is because they're a monopoly, but there's no way of getting rid of that monopoly without state intervention.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's been the Royal Palace Podcast.
Thanks everyone for listening.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.